Good morning. There apparently was going to be a young reporter from the Harvard Crimson who was supposed to introduce me, but I understand he has the best excuse possible that there's breaking news of some sort. So he had to leave, which is exactly the right lesson that you want to take away from this experience. I don't know, does anyone know that guy, what he sounds like? Because I have to introduce myself now. And I could do an imitation if that would be helpful. But anyway, my name is Josh Benton. There are a few ways. I'm very happy to be back at the Georges Conference. I've spoken here, I think, 5 times over the last decade or so, and missed the last couple of years. It's always good to be among folks like you who are young people engaged in journalism. To tell you a little bit of background on myself, I wish this conference had existed a little bit longer than it has, because I was editor-in-chief of the Yale Herald back in 1995, I think it was. Am I correct? There's no one from Yale here? The Yale is just boo, hiss, Yale. All right. The opposite of representative. All right. So I was in your shoes in a certain sense, in a somewhat different era of college journalism, editing my college paper. I then went on into newspapers, a career at a few different places. And in 2007, I came here as a Nieman Fellow, the fellowship program that all of you are going to be applying for in about 10, 15 years, when you want to step away from your day-to-day journalism career to come back to Harvard. But then in 2008, I started the Nieman Journalism Lab, which is a subunit of the Nieman Foundation, where basically we are a small newsroom / think tank about the future of news, where things are going. So I run a small operation upstairs of a team of reporters that looks at how the news is changing, and everywhere from how the reporting is changing, how the discovery of stories is changing, the distribution, how it all gets paid for. We spend a lot of time around business models. So I'm going to be talking today about exactly what's there. 10 things college journalists should know about the media world today. You should feel totally free to interrupt me at any point, ask questions. Well, you should ask questions. Don't just interrupt me, like don't yell or anything, just for fun. If you have a question, feel free to interrupt me. And the last thing I'll say before we get started is my job is to pay attention to this whole universe. So if there's anything that I'm not covering in the slides and we have time at the end, feel free to just ask about whatever you'd like. So I'll start off with, it has to be 10 things because, all journalism is just a list now. That's all it is. BuzzFeed would never do a list of 10 things. They always do odd numbers, and usually unusual odd numbers. They like 21, they never do 20. You can check this out. There's been data analysis of this stuff. Let's start off with the business. The first thing I want to say is, let's do a show of hands. Now, you guys are weird people. You are weird 20-year-olds and 21-year-olds because you all work for college newspapers. You have a different interaction, or college media organizations. I don't want to say just newspapers. How many of you read a print newspaper this morning? Very bold. How many of you read news on a laptop screen this morning? How many of you read news on a phone this morning? All right. It is absolutely true that the shift from laptops to smartphones is almost as big a deal as the shift from print to the web. It's very easy. Many of you have probably seen this set of pictures before. These are 2 pictures from the last 2 times that a new pope was selected. This is when Benedict was selected in 2005. This is when Francis was selected in 2013. Can anyone point out any differences between these 2 photos? This poor fellow in the right-hand corner with the Nokia whatever that is, I'm not sure. On one hand, that person is the trendsetter. I mean, that person is ahead of the curve in every possible way, but is kind of sad and humorous right now. It's very easy to forget how big of a deal this shift is. And I like this because it makes it very clear. This is not that long a period of time. And our lives have shifted enormously. I don't know if any of you are sports folks. ESPN.com just redesigned earlier this month on April 1st. I would never make a major business change on April 1st, but they decided to do that. And this was in their opening introduction to it. In January, we had 94 million users at ESPN.com. 61% of them accessed them only on a mobile device. So that's not even, those are people who didn't look on their laptop even once, only on their phones. And it is remarkable how much news organizations are behind on this transition. There are so many news sites, I'm sure that you've seen them, where you click a link on Twitter or Facebook or whatever social network you're on, and you go to a news page, and the text is tiny, and you can't see it, and it's there's an overlay ad that you can't get rid of, and just these terrible mobile experiences. This is the major driving force in the news business right now from an audience perspective, and it's going to continue to be that. So I think, I'm curious, who has any experience with any of these 9 apps that are right here? Right there, which one?
I really like the New York Times Now.
Yeah, what do you like about it?
I like that they take out quotes from when you're scrolling through the interface, and you can get a good idea what the story is just by seeing this really important quote. They have pictures, and just the nature of our reading has changed where we don't read articles to their entirety anymore. So this is like the new way to get news. Get like a superficial, which is not that great, but.
I'm curious, do you pay for NYT Now?
No, I don't pay for it.
Okay. Do you have a New York Times subscription that, or?
I just have the 10 per month.
Oh, okay.
But I like the side where you can see like the editor's choices. You can scroll to the side.
Right. So I'm curious, NYT Now is always interesting because it is a product by in some ways, fusty old news organization aimed specifically at you guys. So who here uses NYT Now? Okay. Who here, keep your hands up, who here pays for NYT Now? Interesting. Just so you know, NYT Now is going free in the next couple months. So they haven't officially announced that, but that's happening. So you will have access to it. And yeah, you.
So what do you think is the role of like email services like Bits of News, the Skim, Quartz?
Yeah.
When did those start becoming more popular, and how many people do you have a sense of how many people use those services? 'Cause I know me personally, I read all 3 of those every day.
Yeah. Is that how many of you read a digest email that comes up to you every day of some sort? Yeah. Let me be more specific. How many read a digest email that is clearly written? It isn't just a list of headlines or something. Yeah. Email newsletters have had this interesting resurgence in the last 2 years. It's kind of interesting that it parallels the resurgence in podcasting, both of which are technologies that you might have thought peaked around like 2006 or so. I think there are a few things going on there. One is every social network is sort of viewed as a tax on our time in a certain way. You have to be in your inbox anyway. It's not an endless stream of information the same way that you would see on Facebook or Twitter. The fact that it is this contained package is, I think, very appealing. It's also an open platform. News organizations have invested a lot of time into Facebook, for example, for distribution. But what you send out on Facebook only reaches a tiny fraction of the people who like you on Facebook. Whereas if someone subscribes to your email, they get your email. If they listen to your podcast, they get your podcast. I think there are a few things that are going on there. It's more personal, it's more direct, and we've seen a move towards wanting to have very intense one-on-one relationships between the news organization and the audience, and I think email is a good way to do that. So these apps, anyone else use any of these other apps? You can't say BuzzFeed News because that's not out yet. And you probably can't say Global Business Review unless you read Chinese, and that just came out last week. But anyone else use any of these other? Yeah.
Certainly the Yahoo News Digest.
Yeah, and what do you like them?
I like the Yahoo News Digest because at the end of the day,
Mhm.
Circa, I like the idea, but it just feels too limited for me.
Yeah, Circa's in kind of a weird position because they have no voice. They're more of a thought experiment than an interesting experience in a lot of ways. So now this, I'm curious, has anyone ever seen any Now This News? They've gone by different names. This is why they're failing as a company, because you guys are exactly their target audience. They do videos designed to fit on Instagram, to fit on Vine, to fit on Facebook and Twitter. They're entirely socially distributed, funded by the same people who were behind the Huffington Post originally. Interesting ideas, not necessarily a good business model. Anyway, I throw these up there because these are all apps that are doing interesting things on phones. And I think fundamentally we haven't figured out what the experience is on phones that's going to get people interested in news. But these folks are all trying in various ways, and I think it's good to know about them. The other thing, of course, as you can tell by the presence of the letter F and a small bird at the bottom of the slide, is that mobile basically means social, because you spend a lot of time on your phone in Facebook or in Twitter, whatever social network or platform you want to use. That sort of means that publishers are second-class citizens because they don't own the connection with you. They're just providing content into this endless stream of content. Which sort of leads to number 2. News organizations don't know how to make money on social. The share of audience that comes from social networks keeps going up. And wildly different depending on the news organization, but there are plenty of news organizations who get the majority of all their traffic from Facebook. 50% plus one. And yet, they're really not sure how to deal with it. I don't know if anyone see the story about how the New York Times and BuzzFeed and National Geographic were now thinking about publishing directly to Facebook, not just having their stories appear on nytimes.com or whatever. That's sort of because they're not making any money off of the really large amounts of traffic they're getting from there. But in news organizations' mind, the deal with Facebook is you get traffic, and it's up to you to monetize it, which some folks do better than others. With Twitter, you don't get anywhere near as much traffic. Considering how big Twitter is in people's minds and how much discussion is about Twitter, Twitter sends, 1/15 the amount of traffic that Facebook does. But what it is it's very real time, so it lines up with news very well, breaking news, in your stream right away. And it does reach influential people. I hate the word influencers, but influential people would have done a line break. So Tumblr, people thought, news organizations thought, well, we got brand awareness, we have all this nice photography, we'll put it out there, maybe people use it. It's kind of unclear whether they've gotten anything off that. Instagram's even worse because you don't have links. It's just the pictures and the sort of bizarre ways that people say, check our homepage and we have a link there, and maybe if you've got it at the right time, maybe you'll go to the store you want to go to. Snapchat, who the hell knows? News organizations are they know that their kids are using it. They don't know what's going on. Vine, WhatsApp. There's also a trend here. If you look at Facebook and Twitter and Tumblr, these are social networks that are built around links. They're built around, here's something else, and I'm directing your attention to it. The more you get down that list, and WhatsApp's sort of an exception to this, but not really. It's more about staying in the experience. You're in Instagram, and you're in Vine, you're in Snapchat. The folks who made those apps realized they were basically giving away a lot of value by letting people link out of their experience very easily. And they're not interested in continuing to do that. This is sort of the depressing part of the talk, just so you know. So the business models, who knows? No one knows. They are really uncertain for a lot of people and a lot of news organizations. I want to show you just a couple slides. Maybe you've seen this roller coaster simulation. This is newspaper advertising revenue in the United States, adjusted for inflation up to 2013. It's actually gone down since then. The 17, and those are billions, not trillions. I didn't make this slide, I just stole it. Those should be B's instead of T's. That 17 is now under 15 billion, and it keeps dropping by about 8, 9, 10% a year. It wasn't that long ago. I got into the news business in 1996. You can sort of see where things were then, a very different place where they are now. And print advertising is basically going away at uncertain rates of speed. And other revenue streams are not always going so hot either. This is a chart where the top is very faded. I apologize for that, but this shows how the New York Times makes its money. These are third quarter figures over a series of years from 06 to 13. The yellow area is print advertising. So you can see there was more of it and there's less of it. The New York Times has done better than just about anyone else on print advertising in newspapers because it's a lot easier to sell this premium rich audience as opposed to your local Times Gazette. You can see at the very bottom, the New York Times has a tremendously successful paywall by the standards of paywalls, but that little purple line at the bottom is the money that they get from paywalls, from digital subscriptions. You'd rather have it than not have it, but it's hardly a solution to the overall problem. The New York Times is in a very unique position because they are doing so much better than everyone else in the newspaper business. If you had this chart for the Des Moines Register or the Kansas City Star or the Salt Lake Tribune, it would be a much sadder sight. The result of all this is that news organizations aren't really sure what they're doing money-wise. Their advertising money is going away. They expected that digital advertising would fill some of the gap from print advertising, and it has, but only to a small extent. If they've started paywalls, most of them are finding out that their paywalls are plateauing, that they're not getting more new subscribers. They've captured an initial audience, but they're not getting beyond it. They're also finding that their digital subscribers are also old. The average age of a digital subscriber to the New York Times is, I believe this is right, 54. That's a digital subscriber. And then are you just taking people who were previously print subscribers and turning them into digital subscribers, which means you're losing money. In any event, the model for newspapers is in a lot of stress. The model for online outlets is, in almost every case, is purely advertising driven. And advertising online is just as troubled from a publisher's point of view in a lot of ways as print is. Because in the United States, 70% of all online advertising goes to 5 companies. Who can name the 5 companies? The majority of them goes to 2 companies. Who are the 2 companies that throw one out? Google and Facebook. They get a majority of all digital advertising revenue in the United States. And then AOL still gets money somehow. Microsoft and Twitter are underneath there. So there are a lot of questions about the business model. And wherever you go to work after you're done with your collegiate career, there's a good chance there are going to be some questions about how the bills get paid. The last thing I'll say about the business is you will never have a more captive audience than today. I say that because as someone who used to work at a college newspaper, and as someone who's talked to a lot of folks who work at college newspapers, it's easy to forget the advantages that you guys have. Chances are there's no one else who cares about the stuff you write. There's no other news organization that is going to be writing about granular moves in the provost's office in the same way that you're interested in that. You also have a captive audience of an actual campus. If you're the kind of school that, a place like this one, for example, you still see 19-year-olds reading a print newspaper in the dining hall in the morning. That's not something you see in the real life. That's what you see in the zoo of campus life. So a lot of the opportunities that are available to young journalists are in things like audience development and realizing that you sort of have to be chasing audience at every stage of the way once you exit these ivied walls. All right, enough doom and gloom about the business. Let's have some doom and gloom about your careers. No, I'm just kidding. These are just a few broad thoughts. And again, ask questions about anything that is interesting to you here. One thing that I find, I run a small news organization here within the building, so I get a lot of applications from journalists. A lot of them are young journalists who are just out of college. And I'll be honest, one of the very first things that I do when I see someone who looks remotely interesting is go see what their Twitter account looks like. I'm writing about digital media, so it's a little bit different for me, but it's easy to forget that your social media presence is essentially an ongoing audition for work. And I don't mean that in the scary way that you hear about on morning television shows where oh no, they're going to find the photos of you drunk on Facebook. That's not what I mean. I mean in the sense that if I'm hiring someone, I want to know whether they are an interesting human being. And resumes and cover letters are really terrible ways to communicate whether you're an interesting human being. Your social media presence is actually a pretty good way to do that. I can read that and see what you're interested in, who you're reading, what are the kinds of things that you feel you're interested in sharing about. Who are the people that you're having conversations with? Are you interested in a certain topic and talking to the people who are engaged in that topic? So I don't mean this in a scary way. I mean this is a real opportunity to stand out if you're interested in getting a job in journalism. Making sure that your presence online and in social media puts a good light on you is a real potential step up. Aggregation will be an important, yes?
So, on Twitter you can have a private account or a public account. So does this mean that you're suggesting that we all have public accounts on Twitter, that anyone can read it?
If you're interested in a job in journalism, I would say yeah. And again, because of the influencers line I mentioned before, that will be where people look. So if you have a really smartly curated Instagram feed or something, it's probably not going to be as important. Twitter is unusually important there. So I would think about that. Yeah.
So how do you frame, for example, let's say you write an article, so how would you frame it? Hey guys, check out my article, here's my take. What are I would say action words or keywords, buzzwords that you should include in a post if you want to get people's attention and click on the link to read it?
On what platform?
On Twitter.
On Twitter? I mean, on Twitter, I find that attacking it from an angle is usually good. When our Twitter account has 180,000 followers, and when I look at what works, often it's a tweet that highlights an interesting quote from the story or a data point from the story that isn't the lead, that isn't the headline. Something that illustrates, that teases interest without it being sort of the classic Upworthy, you won't believe what happened next. there was a city council meeting and you don't know what happened next. Probably they ended the city council meeting, but it's tough from platform to platform, and the guidances would be different. I think in general it depends on the kind of job that you're at or that you're trying to get. But I think SMART does better than SEO clogs, tons of hashtags. You want to come across as an intelligent person who has something interesting to say, and I think that strategy works a little bit better. Yeah.
I notice when I follow journalists on Twitter, there's people who keep strictly professional accounts and people who kind of mix personal conversations or musings with their work. What's your opinion on that? And if you're going to mix it, like, where's the line?
Yeah. I tend to think that having two separate accounts, it encourages you to not actually post to either of them, just adding a little extra friction there. Oftentimes when that happens, it's because they work for an unenlightened news organization that has very strict rules about engaging there. So if you have a choice and your employer doesn't care, I think one account is the best way to go. There's also a tactical question in that, which is that you will probably at some point leave your job, and when that happens, does that other account belong to your employer? There have been disputes over that. You want to be able to carry your audience with you to wherever you're going next. So I think as far as the line, I started blogging back in the late 1990s when that was a thing people still did. And at the time, I was working for a newspaper, for the Dallas Morning News, and that same question came up. So for me, the rules I had was I was covering education, so I would never write about education. I would never write about politics, because that is just a third rail in every way. But other than that, once I sort of define out those restrictions, there's a whole wide world of interesting stuff out there. And I thought that having showing personality and being an interesting human was a worthy trade-off for the slight chance that someone might be, angered by something. I also think the rules are a lot looser now than they were a few years ago. Yeah.
Does this mostly lie in like Twitter, or when you look at people's social media, like do you look at Facebook as well, or is just like the sharing mechanism that is Twitter more appealing?
I will look at Facebook if it's there, but often if you're smart, you have privacy settings set on Facebook that aren't letting a rando job person look at everything that you've written there. The other thing is that Facebook is inherently, Twitter is so optimized for news. The fact that it is essentially a headline and link, that's a reductionist way of looking at it. The fact that so many people in journalism are on it, that would be where I would be looking for someone as a journalist. What if I'd be looking at, their Instagram to see whether they go to interesting places, I guess. I don't know what I look at their Instagram for, but I think Twitter is probably the number one place there. All right. Another thing that people often forget is aggregation will be an important part of your first job. One thing college newspapers do very well is train you in a certain set of skills and give you a certain set of experiences. Those skills and experiences don't always apply perfectly to your first job. Chances are very good aggregation is going to be a very important part of it. It's not something that a lot of people get a lot of practice in at a lot of college papers. So it sort of ties into the social media idea, like be a good filter of news, a good filter of information, particularly because the stuff that you're actually producing in your first job is probably not going to be the most interesting stuff in the world. I hate to break that to you. If I was simply focused on what I did in my first job with the Toledo Blade, it would be a lot of traffic accidents and city council meetings. Yes?
So are you, I know a lot of people trying to get jobs in journalism after college who are very hesitant to consider taking jobs that are aggregation based. So
Yeah.
Are you saying that that's a silly attitude, or?
I don't think it's a silly attitude. I think the question is what kind of aggregation you're talking about. There are plenty of content farms where there's no actual journalism being done, where I would be very hesitant to go in that direction. But there are also lots of good news organizations that have as a job for usually their most junior people that they are news blogging, that they are being essentially on aggregation duty. And
say you're a newsletter. Someone's obviously aggregating what you're reading stuff at the bottom.
Sure, yeah. This man reads our newsletter. You get a check plus for that. Yeah, so I think, like, for example, if you get a job at Time Magazine out of college, first of all, congratulations. Second of all, chances are you're not going to be writing next week's cover story, right? The first thing they're going to ask you to do is to be sort of a filter for the news. And so the things that you learn from seeing interesting things, having a good field of vision on what might be interesting, adding your own twist to it so it stands out from all the other people who are doing the same thing, those are just useful skills, and they're worth thinking about how to get better at them. This is another thing since the first job that you get is probably, again, not going to be writing cover stories for Time Magazine. God bless if it is. You're probably going to have to do your most ambitious work on your own at first. And what do I mean by this? I mean that when you take your first job, you need to think very seriously about what it is that you're going to be asked to do, and think about what it is that you want to do. Chances are there's going to be a gap between those two things. The wonderful thing about the internet and digital publishing is that you don't need institutional permission to do the kind of stuff that you want to do. So in other words, if you get a job at some sort of content farm, that's what you got, but you secretly want to be Ta-Nehisi Coates, or you secretly want to be, insert internet celebrity journalist here, think about the work that they're doing and think about how you can do it on the side. When you're young, you have energy, you're not a broken down old man like me, you really have the chance to do all this sort of stuff on the side. One exercise I usually ask people, young journalists to go through when they're thinking about this is sit down, take a sheet of paper, and write down 20 news organizations that publish the kind of stuff that you're interested in, that you would want to write for. And then have a separate list, which is identify 20 journalists who write the kinds of stories that you want to do there, that you would want to do. And then use that as a guidepost. Say, all right, in the next year, I'm going to be published as a freelancer in 5 of these publications. Now, the stuff that they want you to do may not be the sexy stuff that you really want to do. But if you're stuck in a job that doesn't let you do really interesting stuff, you need to do that on the side. And that is a really important part of getting the next job. You need to be able to establish your name, relationships with editors, relationships with publications. That list of people who are doing the kind of stuff that you're doing, you sure better follow them on Twitter. You better see if they're having an interesting conversation on Twitter that you have a chance to engage in, that you're doing that. I've seen lots of really smart young people get from 0 experience to really nice jobs from how they interact with people who are in the space they want to get into. It's sort of networking, but it's, I think, a better form of networking than, oh, well, so you went to Harvard 8 years before I did, so can you give me a job? That other form of networking leaves a dirty feeling in my mind. But I think finding conversations that you can be a part of and being engaging with that is important. And you're going to need to do that outside of your job. There's a very good chance. Oh, yes.
Yeah, so let's say you're working on something independently, you're doing some freelance work. How would you approach a publication to try to get that published? What's like the best avenue to try to publish work you've done on your own?
Well, if it's clear, if you can find out who the editor is, find that out. Oftentimes you can't. If you can't, then I would find a reporter or a writer who has written things for that publication that are similar to what you're talking about. And I'd ask them, who's the editor who I should pitch this to? Oftentimes they'll make an introduction if that's appropriate. They will sometimes say, you may approach them and say, this is the idea that I have. Do you think they'd be interested? And they'll say, no, actually, that's what they were buying in 2012, but now they're doing X. So you might have an ability to do that. It's a good exercise anyway to do that. But one thing not to group all of young journalists together, but one thing I've found is that a lot of young journalists are sort of hesitant to just send the email or make the phone call to find out that information. If it's not easily Googleable, then there's some hesitation in going to seek out the information, which when you think about it is a really weird thing for a journalist. Really strange idea. You have to go out and seek that out. So that would be the first thing, to find out who the person is, either if you can find it on your own or by finding someone who already knows that connection. The corollary to what I was saying before is that you will go farther if you create like you consume. When I think of the ambitious work that college newspapers do, I often think of really long pieces that would never be the kind of thing that people would read on their own if they weren't. There's a different scale for, like, I'm the kind of person who can write 10,000 words about a subject versus I would ever be interested in reading 10,000 words about a subject. One thing I think can be useful is take a week of whatever you're producing for your news organization and look at what you're producing, and then go back and look at what you consumed during that week. You'll often find there's a really large gap between the two. So I've seen young journalists who get sort of tied into the romance of, like, I'm going to get a fedora with a press card in the brim and act like an old newspaper person. and the kinds of things that are produced out of that mechanism, think about what you're consuming. What you're consuming is probably more similar to what your bosses would like you to be producing than maybe the somewhat conservative mindset that you can have on your own. Yeah.
So like right now for a lot of us, we're still operating a print newspaper. And
Sure.
one struggle that I have is you still have a bunch of editors who need to create content that fits well with print.
Right.
And then when it comes to online, normally that becomes the sort of like the second place that it lives after it goes, it's kind of written to fit in print edition. And then the online version might like just be bare words or really not be something that I could imagine myself reading online if I'm just scrolling through a bunch of links.
Right.
So like how, as a media organization, do you do both of those well?
Yeah, it is really tough for a list of reasons. It's really tough because generally speaking, you're someone who's running a new college newspaper is doing it for a year or a semester. They don't really have time to figure out what they're doing, much less, figure out how they want to change what they're doing. Second, often there is an alumni board or some sort of overseeing organization that might have some sort of retrograde ideas about, well, it's the print newspaper, that's an important thing, that's what you got to do. That was a terrible impression of all your advisors. And then you also have the fact that college newspaper people are generally not paid to have full-time jobs. I mean, some are, but you have classes, you have things to do. The real-timeness of the web is a really tough conflict there. And that's part of the reason why I've talked to a lot of hiring editors at news organizations who say that they're kind of disappointed in the 22-year-olds that they get because they have this extra print mindset because that's what they've come up through. So it's a really tough problem. It's a tough problem for professional newspapers who don't have those same constraints. I was talking with the managing editor of a large American newspaper recently that is considered one of the more digitally advanced newspapers in America, and he told me that 85% of all their stories still get filed between like 4 p.m. and 8 p.m., which is the time when newspaper stories get filed, despite the fact that the digital audience is so much vastly larger. So if there was an easy solution and if there was just like an app you could download to fix that, I would tell you, but there isn't. It's about culture change. It's about aligning your resources. And I don't know if the folks from Oregon are going to be able to have a chance to share with you their experience, but it takes in some cases a really top-down shift. Yeah, it's hard. But I would advise you all not to create a climate that you're all mercenaries, but you work for news organizations that have their own incentives and their own structures, but you're also individuals. You can take those changes for yourself in ways that go beyond the workflows that can often be very rigid for the folks you work for. Number 8, if you have any interest in programming at all, learn to code. We have debates in our little world about should journalists learn to code. Like there's going to be a vote, and if the answer is yes, then every journalist is going to learn to code. It's a beautiful thing, news democracy. So I say if you have any interest in it, because if you have no interest in coding, then if you just really want to write, long pieces for the New York Review of Books, then it's probably a waste of your time to spend much effort there. But if you have even a slightest inkling of interest, you should pursue it. This is Marty Barron, the editor of the Washington Post, gave a talk earlier this week. 4 years ago, we had 4 engineers in the newsroom. Now it's going to be 47 engineers in the newsroom. There are so many people who are able to get jobs at places like the Post or the New York Times who come from a journalism background, but they're not distinguishing themselves because they got a mayor, in trouble or anything. They're distinguishing themselves because they also have the skill of being able to code interactives, or they also have the skill of being able to analyze data in an interesting and smart way, or they also have the skill of being smart with design. These things which can be the sort of +1 on your resume will make you stand out and will make it a lot easier for you to get a job. If there's one way that you can guarantee that you're going to have a job in journalism for the next 10, 15 years, I don't want to project beyond that. If you're a good coder who has journalism instincts, you are all set. This is the job board at NICAR, the Computer Assisted Reporting Conference every year. There are plenty of opportunities here. If this was instead of the National Institute for Computer Assisted Reporting Conference and it was the National Institute for Sports Game Stories Conference, there would not be nearly as many job openings. Yes?
Like, what are the specific programs you would recommend us to learn? And apart from coding, like, since the changes in journalism is kind of unpredictable and uncertain, so
Yeah.
what else are we supposed to learn to better prepare ourselves?
Yeah. I would say, so from a coding perspective, I'd say the first thing that you would do would be to learn HTML, CSS. That's the basics. From there, I would go into either or both JavaScript and Python. JavaScript will be useful for a lot of web, sort of the next step up from web producer jobs, for building interactives, things like that. Python will get you access to data analysis jobs, data journalist jobs in ways that can be useful. Basically, almost every news shop in America is either a Python shop or a Ruby shop, but I think Python has the edge. And if you know one, then it's not too difficult to transition to the other. Other skills that are worth knowing, I think if every time there's a new social platform, you should be on it and you should be playing around on it. I think that sort of native curiosity and interest takes you a long way there. And from a reporting and writing perspective, being practiced in lots of different formats. To be able to write a really good short piece and a really good long piece, that diversity, I think, really helps you a lot in your career. Yeah.
I'm interested in learning to code, and I've played around with HTML, CSS. But just from a practical perspective, do you have any examples of somebody who wants to go into writing who is pitched an idea to complement a story or something like that, and was able to tackle both of those things? Because I don't really. Sometimes I'll be like, oh, this will look cool with the graphic when I'm writing a story, but I don't really know how to plan it out.
I don't know a lot of cases like that for someone who's pitching as a freelancer or anything like that, but there are lots of cases. So for example, the New York Times Interactive Desk has a lot of people who come in from a coding perspective, but who have an idea for a piece of journalism, who will then pitch the piece of journalism and will handle both ends of it. That's a fairly frequent occurrence. It is tough because the number of people who have both skills is pretty small. That's what gives you the enormous edge, but there aren't that many of them. Yeah.
I mean, I think if you do get a job and why you got the job was because of your coding experience. I mean, do you think, are you really going to get to do that much writing, or are they just going to put you on all the coding?
I mean, it varies. So in a lot of news organizations, you will not be hired to be the coding guy or the coding gal, I should say. This slide, all these engineers who are in the newsroom, these are people who are engaged in that world. This is actually one of the things that's changed over the last few years. News organizations used to have coders and engineers who were out of the newsroom, who were either answered up to the business side of the operation in most cases, and maybe you could get them to work on journalism projects, but it took a UN summit to get everyone at the same table. Now you're seeing many more people who have these jobs who are in the newsroom. So there are lots of people who are hired as journalists who write stories, but they got hired because they have the coding prowess, and that's something that's an add-on. There are also people, I said, in the other direction, people who get hired as coders who go in the other direction. You'll find a decent number of bylines in the Times and the Post that are actually people who were hired as coders. Number 9, I know we're running out of time very soon. This seems sort of counterintuitive. When I was, the good jobs are more centered in New York than ever before. When I was your age, I got an internship at the Toledo Blade in lovely Toledo, Ohio, and I got to do some amazing stuff. I spent a month in the South Pacific chartering a yacht to go to Pitcairn Island on the Toledo Blade's dime. I covered the Northern Ireland peace talks for the Toledo Blade. I went to Berlin for the 10th anniversary of the wall coming down for the Blade. It was a small paper, sort of, in Northwest Ohio, not the most exciting place in the world, but there was a place of ambition, a place where you would learn an awful lot of stuff, and really there was a nice way to move up to the next level. I went from there to the Dallas Morning News and then came here. Today, it's a little bit harder because the Toledo Blades of this world are much sadder places than they used to be. They have lost a lot of their staff. They've lost their advertising base. They've spent the last 10 years firing people in slow motion, in round of layoffs after round of layoffs. The result is that it's a lot harder to go out to a local place and move your way up in the field than it used to be. At one level, you could imagine that digital distribution means you could be anywhere. And there are certainly places who take advantage of that, where you can work for an outlet that's in New York, but you're working remotely from some other place. But the reality is, for whatever reason, there's been this new concentration of jobs in New York City. If you want to live in New York City, that's great. And there's a secondary concentration in DC. But this is one of the things that I find really troubling about the larger world, which was that the United States, unlike Europe, developed our news ecosystem in a strange way just because we're so damn big. There wasn't national newspaper distribution, for decades and decades. The result was, because of a variety of historical factors, we had strong metro papers in Dallas and Denver and Minneapolis and every city. Digital doesn't work that way, which makes the local news a real question. It means that you guys who have reasons to be geographically based have an extra responsibility, but it also means that when you leave those cloistered halls, there's a lot more gravitational pull to New York and DC than there used to be. Corollary to that, I just call it corollary because I actually had 12, and 2 of them had to become corollaries because 10 was what was on your sheet. If at all possible, find a way to work at a place with money and ambition. I mean, that seems obvious, right? But one thing I often say to folks that are your age is that you want to be able to, in a kind of a position, at the kind of a job, at the kind of place that when you're 50, you'll look back and say, I'm glad I spent my early 20s there. That was an experience. You're in the experience collecting business right now. That's what basically your 20s is all about. So, for example, the Washington Post, was purchased not too long ago by Jeff Bezos, the man behind Amazon, a man who has, I believe, I've heard, a lot of money. And the result is that the Post is spending a ton of money on hiring all those 47 engineers and expanding their newsroom and doing new projects. That makes them a tremendously exciting place to be because they don't have to make money right now. The Boston Globe is a version of that, purchased by a mere billionaire, not like a 17 times over billionaire like Washington, but nonetheless, they at the moment don't have the same sort of pressure on them to hit a profit margin every year because they're owned by someone who doesn't need the money. I'll put it as a separate version of this, BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed and Vox and Vice, these VC-funded places, they all have their pluses and their minuses, but they are not places where your individual contributions are going to be evaluated based on whether they're adding $1 to the bottom line or not. These are places that are aiming for the future and just trying to get as good and as big as fast as they possibly can. So particularly when you're young and you have the opportunity to think about the kind of places to work at, think about, is this a place that is going to have outsized ambition and reduced money pressures? If you can find that, congratulations. The last thing I'll say, publishers need people with journalism instincts in technology and in business. Their news organizations, particularly the large ones, I'm thinking of the large national news organizations mostly, but others as well. They've really put a lot of emphasis on people on the product side, on the technology side. There are a lot of openings there, a lot of opportunities there. And one thing that they find is that they can hire people who have product development experience, but who generally don't have news experience. They might have previously been helping Procter & Gamble come up with a new kind of soap. And I'm sure they're very good at soap ideation, but nonetheless, when that transfers over, it doesn't always work. Technology, there are plenty of people who can write wonderful code, but don't have the journalism instincts. So there's a real opportunity. When you think about opportunities in news organizations, don't just be limited to the ones that will give you a byline, the ones that will give you a place in the newsroom, a few desks down for the managing editor. There are lots of opportunities in technology and in business, on product, that news organizations are looking for people who have journalism instincts and journalism experience. So I would be very much thinking about those as a place where you could possibly land. So I don't know if we have any time left, or do we? Okay, so that's just the general thing. Old models are declining, new ones are being born. It's better than a few years ago when the old models were declining, but the new ones weren't being born yet. There's greater differentiation of opportunity than before. There are many different kinds of opportunities and jobs. And I think on net, it is a very exciting time to be in journalism. I envy all the possibilities you guys are going to have ahead of yourselves, even if you might not get to spend a month in the South Pacific. But hey, what can you do? So any questions about any of that or anything else that is in our turf?
If I were to work in a bureau overseas, like which area do you think is more like prospering and can have more like job opportunities?
Sure. There traditionally were two ways to get an international posting. One was you go work for one news organization and you work there for a decade or more. And you start covering suburban cops, and then you move up to covering City Hall, and then you cover the State House, and then eventually you get the Berlin Bureau, right? The other way to do it would be to just go to Berlin or Bangladesh or wherever you want to go and start stringing and start freelancing, taking advantage of the fact that in a lot of those places it doesn't cost very much to live. You can get a few freelance relationships and do that. Then you get noticed and you become the person who's breaking all the stories in Pakistan, and then the New York Times comes calling and says, do that. Those both still work. The issue is that the first one, there are many fewer places that have foreign bureaus. The Dallas Morning News, when I started out there, had 15 people stationed overseas and bureaus all around the world. They now have one guy in Mexico. The Boston Globe used to have 6 foreign bureaus. They now have 0 foreign bureaus. If you want to do it from a newspaper point of view, there's basically the Times, the Post, and the LA Times. That's pretty much all that remains. The other way, the sneaky way to do it, if you really want the living abroad experience, is newswires. Dow Jones Newswire, Reuters, AP, those are places that often there's a path in. Like with AP, for example, you're not going to just start there. You either have to go the freelancing route or the stringing route, or start in Topeka and move your way up. But that's where actually a large number of the jobs are for American journalists stationed overseas. They're very business-oriented jobs, so a lot of people don't find them interesting. You know, it's a lot of earnings reports for steel companies in Malaysia or whatever. But they are out there. Other question? Yeah.
I was wondering, on a related note, when you're freelancing, how do you establish credibility without being able to say, oh, I'm a reporter with the Washington Post?
Well, you say I'm a reporter doing a story for the Washington Post. If you are freelancing for them, yeah. Play around the language there. The other way, if you don't have the idea, then you say I'm a reporter who has previously who's written stories. I've been in the Post and the Times or whatever it may be. But yeah, there's no doubt that you will get your calls returned more quickly if you are a staff writer at the New York Times than if you are a freelancer who's pitching a story that may or may not go somewhere. Yeah. Other questions? Anything else? Great. Thank you very much.